Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Renee Barron. I'm a certified clinical hypnotherapist. I specialize in hypnotherapy, biofeedback, which is stress relief or emotional control, inner child strengthening, life script reprogramming, anxiety workshops, issues around PSTD, trauma recovery, anxiety workshops, self-esteem building, image building, transgender and LGBTQ support. I do past life regressions and quantum healing. So the topic today is going to be a very controversial topic, but I'm not shying away from this because it's important that we hear the message and to analyze and scrutinize the information with a critical mind, an open heart and mind. Because I'm not here to offend anyone's beliefs, but this belief system that we've been conditioned to have is hurting people. In fact, many people have killed themselves over these belief systems. And so I'm going to be talking about two tools that are used by the governments, the systems they put in place, all the conditionings and the all-out war against any thoughts or ways of being other than what is connected to these two tools. And that's the Bible and Christianity. And it's no secret. I used to be a minister, and I was considering getting into the missionary work. I was married to a minister, elder in the congregation that I belong to. So I'm well-versed in the Bible. But I want to mention that you can look in your own Bible at Matthew 10:34. And I just want to mention that I'm no longer associated with religion, any religion. I'm not associated with Christianity anymore. I was born in the Christian faith. I separated in about 2003 because it was hurting me and it was hurting my children. And so I'm going to quote Matthew 10, verses 34. So you may remember this from your Bibles. It says, "Do not think I came to put peace upon the earth. I came to put not peace, but a sword. I came to cause division with a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a young wife against her mother-in-law. Indeed, a man's enemies will be persons of his own household. He that has greater affection for father or mother than for me is not worthy of me. And he that has greater affection for son or daughter than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not accept his torture stake and follow after me is not worthy of me. He that finds his soul will lose it, and he that loses his soul for my sake will find it." Now you may remember that. That's from a different translation. I'm going to read it directly from the King James Version Bible. So it says, think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And as a man's foes shall be they of his own household. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And that taketh not his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. So right there, this statement is the reason we have a lot of homeless teenagers who are gay or transgender or have desires to be transgender. the families are just kicking out their children. Here where I live in Minnesota, there's a large homeless population, and this is across the nation. People are just throwing. How do you have a child that you bonded with your whole life and you love dearly with your soul to just kick them out like that? With no resources, nowhere to turn, putting them at risk and danger in the streets. You didn't make provisions for them, you just kicked them out. Even when Adam and Eve sinned, God didn't just kick them out, he prepared them before he made them leave the Garden of Eden, right? From what you've read. He made loin coverings and he prepared a place for them and he taught them before he kicked them out. People are not preparing their children before they kick them out of their house. They're not prepared as a teenager. They're not even 18 yet. A lot of these kids are not even 18. Even when they turn 18, they are not ready for life. They are not ready to survive in this world. Even my adult children who are in their early 20s, I had to change my role and help them learn how to be adulting themselves. You know, how to do taxes, how to do this, how to parent, how to take care of babies, how to parent, how to do different things. The role changes, but it never stops. And so for me, that's unfathomable that people would kick out their own children like that in the streets with not caring. I know it has to be eating up your insides. And if you think you're doing good because of what you've read in the Bible, they use a few scriptures like Revelation 21:8. It says, but as for the cowards and those without faith and those who are disgusting in their filth and murderers and fornicators and those practicing spiritism and idolaters and all the liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur. This means the second death. Now, why is this scripture only associated with homosexuality? Have you thought about that? Because it says, disgusting in their filth. I see a lot of filth. That's why I left religion. There's a lot of filth in the church. And you see it, you know it. If you're a churchgoer, you know. Your children are not safe in there. There are pedophiles. There are people who prey on women, like the ministers, not just his wife, but he's preying on the women in the church, or maybe even the church boy that hasn't, or the tambourine player, as we call them, who's secretly gay. And some ministers are in relationships with them too. And it says immoral people. There's a lot of immoral people in the world and in the church, and they're all mostly Christian. There's people who are idolaters. What do you see in the church? Idols everywhere. Where do you see it? It's idols. It says adulterers. How many people do you know cheating on their wives or their husbands? This scripture applies to all of that. But they only pay attention to this part. Men who submit to homosexual acts, men who practice homosexuality. That's the only thing. They leave out the rest. But it applies to all of that. And in this world today, that covers almost everybody. In the church, outside the church. So why do you limit it to just the LGBTQ community? So in 1973, The American Psychiatric Association declared homosexuality would no longer be considered a psychiatric disorder. Yes, they called it a psychiatric disorder. Since then, many of the medical professions are in support and approval of homosexual life. Psychotherapist Albert Ellis said that, or declared that, homosexual relations are not in the least perverse, but consist of healthy human behavior. That's what it says. Enslavement used to be, or an enslaved person used to be considered having a psychiatric disorder if they were trying to be free and didn't want to be enslaved. So there's a book called Homosexual Behavior Reports. It says homosexual women suffer significantly more from excessive alcohol use and abuse than heterosexual women. Some researchers also claim that suicide attempts are unusually common among young homosexual men. Well, I got one thing. I do agree that the suicide rates are very high. But where do they base this off of? How can you collect data to prove that statement? Think critically. That statement is very subjective. It's not true. And they can't really prove it. It's just a statement. That's their perspective. Now, I had a thing about this next point that I want to make, because I don't believe that parents should be giving the school system so much authority and power to teach and train their children. What's your role as a parent? What are you teaching them? What morals are you teaching them? What are you helping them to learn aside from what they learn at school? You know, there's a lot the schools that don't teach. If you're just allowing the schools to teach your children, then they're very uneducated for life. The school system is a system that conditions our children. This teaching of children used to be the parents' job, their role. They learned cooking, sewing, they learned economics, they learned so much at home until the government decided, no, it's time to send those kids to school. And it became a system to condition your children. Now, I don't believe in the school teaching your children about sex. It's not their place. It's not their role. I think it's the parents' job. And I have people who will disagree and say that some parents are not fit parents and they need some type of support in the school system to help. Well, I do agree, possibly for children or teens who are LGBTQ, but because they need some sort of support, they're going, some of them are afraid to talk to their families, or they may have talked to their families and their families are not supportive. In cases like that, I think they do need some support, and they do need guidance there, someone to help them through that. But basically, I think it's out of the school's role. So this report came from Britain. So one British educator lamented that in schools, all sex education programs are made for heterosexuals. Not one of them had a single program for gay pupils. He complained that most school libraries only stock romances with heterosexual heroes and heroines, despite the increasing volume of gay fiction. He pinpointed the cause of prejudice against homosexuals, the idea that heterosexuality is superior, is precisely the attitude at the root of prejudice. Well, there's some validity in that. There's some validity, but when the schools get involved, they do not include the parent. It's not the school's job to, I think we need a lot better parenting skills. We need a lot of parenting skills. We need agencies that are supportive to young people. And there are some out there, but there needs to be a lot more. But it's not in the school's role, as far as I'm concerned. And that's just my opinion. I think other people will have different opinions on that. But let's get back to the scriptures, because these people always quote certain scriptures in the Bible that shows homosexuality is wrong, right? One of them is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18. It says, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin that a man may commit outside of his body. It says, every other sin that a man may commit is outside his body. But whoever practices sexual immorality is sinning against his own body. You must not lie down with a male the same way you lie down with a woman. This is Leviticus 18:22. God, in keeping with the desires of their hearts, gave them over to uncontrolled sexual passion. For their females changed the natural use of themselves into one contrary to nature. That's Romans chapter 1, verse 24, 26. Do not be misled. Those who are sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, men who submit to homosexual acts, men who practice homosexuality, thieves, greedy persons, drunkards, revilers, and extortioners will not inherit God's kingdom. Now that scripture I'd like to highlight out of all of them, because it's not just homosexuals, right? It's adulterers, it's thieves, greedy persons. How many greedy persons do we see? Look at the corporations that are milking the public, destroying the environment without any concern at all, destroying our earth. That is greed. Drunkards, revilers, extortioners will not inherit God's kingdom. That will pretty much wipe out a lot of people on this earth if they're trying to get into God's kingdom. Now, I mentioned these scriptures and I read a few with the King James translation, because King James VI wrote, or they say oversaw, the translation of the Bible, right? Okay. So before he did the translation of the Bible, he wrote another interesting book. And I'm going to share my screen right now. You see this book here? Donald Tyson, The Demonology of King James I. So he wrote this little tool before he wrote the Bible, or oversaw the translation. Now, we know that people, the common people, did not have access to a Bible back then. It was considered the Dark Ages. And the only people with the translations would be the Catholic Church. They held the knowledge. They were very, very powerful. And the masses of people didn't own anything. They were, very poor and controlled by the Catholic Church. So in 1957, King James VI of Scotland and number one of England, who commissioned the King James Bible, he wrote Demonology, set out on his beliefs that Satan and witches, a historical work, an important read, he says, for scholars of religion. This book allows the reader to study the beliefs and ideas of King James. Demonology is known as one of the most interesting and controversial books in the history of Christianity. Now, although he was a king of both countries, James attempted to create a full governmental union, and enabled a theologian ordered a new translation of the Bible, which became known as the Authorized King James Version of the Bible. Sorry, I had to sneeze. So this book acts as a political and theological dissertation in the form of a philosophical dialogue between these two characters. Philomathus and Eppersternon, if I'm pronouncing it right. They debate the various topics of magic, sorcery, witchcraft, and demonology. The purpose seems to be of an educational piece on the study of witchcraft and to inform the public about the histories and etymologies of all subcategories involved in magical practices. The work also serves to make formal accusations against the practice of witchcraft and comparatively elaborates James's view, the James from the Bible, against the papistry, or what we know as the popes today. So in preface, King James states that he chose to write the content in form of a dialogue to better entertain the reader. By doing so, he follows the method of many philosophical writers prior to his time. As the main plot, Philomathus hears news in the kingdom regarding the rumors of witchcraft, which seems all miraculous and amazing, but he could find no knowledge on the matter to have a serious political discussion on the issue. He finds a philosopher named Epistemon, and it's spelled Epistemon, who is very knowledgeable on the topics of theology. Now, this Demonology Bible was written in 1611 in the 17th century. In 1597, in 1597, King James VI of Scotland published a compendium on witchcraft called Demonology. That's when the Demonology Bible was written. It was published in England in 1603. when James acceded to the English throne. So the Bible, though, was written in 1611, the 7th century. So excuse me for that mistake. I was kind of disorganized my notes. So why was this book written? So James was interested himself in the trials, the witch trials, and was a direct participant in much of the questioning. He mentioned in his Tolbooth speech in 1591 that the proceedings against the accused witches occupied him for a full 9 months. And it would not be excessive to say that he was the prime mover in the whole affair. Undoubtedly, he observed the torture of the accused and heard the confessions wrung from their own agonized mouth. He was gratified to learn that Agnes Sampson, that the devil considered him to be his chief opponent. And it was for this reason that Satan hated him and wished to bring him about his death. She testified that when the witches asked Satan why he hated King James so much, the devil replied, by reason the king is the greatest enemy he hath in the world. By this extraordinary statement, the devil cast James into a role of an avenging knight of the Christian faith. James was fond of making reference to the warrior mounted upon the white horse in Revelation. And keep that in mind, the book of Revelation, who is prophesied to descend to earth to punish the wicked in the latter days, which James believed to already have arrived. As an intensely religious man and the leader of his nation in matters of military, spiritual, and judicial, it would have been difficult for James to decline the role of Satan's chief adversary. He accepted it as a challenge, and he spent the better part of the next 4 decades trying to do it honor. Since the mythic figure upon the white horse is so central to the view James held of his own crusade against witchcraft, it is worth quoting as relevant verses from the King James Bible version of the text. Now, it's really interesting. This book was written just before the Crusades against witchcraft, right? And it outlines step by step the procedures they were supposed to take and what these witches were supposed to believe in. And the book of Revelation is a direct passage from this book. As there are other books that are taken from this book. But we'll get into that, and I'm going to continue. I'm going to make the point, but I want you to hear the history of it. In the Bible, in 1 Corinthians 1:3, it says that magicians and what is this word? Okay, necromancy. And what that is, necromancy, that is like spirit mediums who can see into the future or the past, people with the gift of vision. They are the devil's masters, but sorcerers and witches are the devil's servants. He did not accept the definition, believing as he did that all who work any form of magic will eventually fall under the power of Satan. But he could not present a more concise or valid reason. So he replied, the reason the king is the greatest enemy he hath in the world. By this extraordinary statement, the devil cast James into the role of an avenging knight of the Christian faith. James was fond of making reference to the warrior mounted on the white horse, who is prophesied to descend to the earth to punish the wicked in the latter days, which James believed to have already arrived. An intensely religious man, and I think I read that. I must have put this in twice. So this is a passage I'm going to read that is directly in this book. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he sat upon him, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes are a fiery flame, and on his head were many crowns, and he had a name written that no man knew but himself. That's from this book, not the Bible first. It was in this book first. So a note on this book, I didn't want to make an aim to read this book, but in the note from note 4, James regarded magic as synonymous with necromancy or mediumship, and sorcery and synonymous with witchcraft. The best definition of the distinction between these two branches of the occult arts that James can find is that what he refers to as the difference vulgar and betwixt them. That magicians and necromancers are the devil's masters, but the sorcerers and witches are the devil's servants. He believed that they would all fall under the power of Satan. So this person in the book of Epithermon, it says, yet, he made the argument, yet if you will mark the words of the text, you will find clearly that Saul saw that apparition. For giving you that Saul was under chamber at the making of the circles and conjurations, needful for that purpose, as none of that craft will permit any others to behold at the time. Yet it is evident by the text that how soon that once that unclean spirit was fully risen, she called upon Saul, for it is said in the text that Saul knew him to be Samuel, which could not have been by hearing tell only of an old man with a mantle, since there were many more old men dead in Israel than Samuel, and the common dress of the whole country was mantles. As to the next, that it was not the spirit of Samuel, I grant in the proving whereof you need not insist, since all Christians of whatsoever religion agree upon that, and none but either mere ignorance or necromancers or witches doubt thereof. And the devil is permitted at sometimes to put himself in the likeness of saints, is plain in the scriptures, where it is said that Satan can transform himself into an angel of light, and that's taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1-4. And he said, neither could that cause any inconvenience with the visions of the prophets, since it is most certain that God would not permit him to deceive his own. But only such as first willfully deceive themselves by running into him, whom God then suffers to fall into their own snares and justly permits them to be deluded with great efficacy of deceit, because they would not believe the truth, as Paul says. So the notes on book 1, the allusion of James to strange news may be a punning reference to the tract news from Scotland published in 1592, which describes the doing in the Black Berwick witchcraft affair of the previous year. So it says that the python was an enormous serpentine dragon that guarded the oracle of Gaia at Delphi on a sloped Mount Parnassus. The god Apollo slew the python and took over the oracle, making it his own. There was an oracle. The oracle was a woman who was known as Pythoness. She sat above the fissure of rising gases upon a tripod or 3-leg seat, her body positioned so that the steam from the fissure rose between her legs and was presumed to enter her womb. Whether as a result of breathing this vapor or from some natural inclination of her nature, she fell into prophetic trances during which she uttered future events in the form of enigmatic verses. Now, this oracle of Delphi was this, we need to unpack it a little bit, because she practiced hypnosis, and most people can be what they call somnambulists. And if you daydream a lot, you have an inclination to become a medium or someone who can see visions and things like that. And they know this. And that's what this book is for, to put a stop to that kind of thing. It's very easy to go into hypnosis. We do it every day, all day. Now, I would be in the position of this woman. I don't do mediumship or anything like that, but I'm a hypnotherapist, and it would have been something King James thought was a threat to his kingdom. And so the term Pythoness came to be applied generally to any woman who uttered oracle information and is synonymous with a prophetess. To have the spirit of Pytho or spirit of Python is to be possessed by a familiar spirit that speaks ocular information. Oracular information. I don't practice witchcraft. I'm not under the influence. I'm a hypnotherapist and I help people. But he wanted to root out anything other than what he believed, and he wanted this kingdom he was building around the world to believe the same thing so he could control the masses. And at this time, the masses were the witches and warlocks that he was attacking. So that's why, there's in the Bible, it's a lot of information about not believing in sorcerers, and he goes on to say, sorcerers must not be allowed to live. However, Knox added the footnote, in the Hebrew word is feminine for witch, but they have a word that they use for men and for women. So the guy that is disputing it, Philomathus, he said, if all men are subject to the evil effects of witchcraft, he asks how any man can be brave enough to punish them. His friend rather stiffly replies that we should not refrain from virtue merely because the way is perilous. And in any case, no one is more protected against witchcraft than those who zealously prosecute witches. The magistrate who sits in judgment over the witch is protected from her malice in proportion to the degree of his severity towards her. And the more lenient he is, the more he is in danger. On the contrary, if the magistrate applies the just laws of God in a rigorous way to the examination and punishment of witches, God will protect him. So whose philosophy is really in this book? And this is not the Bible yet. Whose ideas and whose judgments and whose values are here? So some points to consider: that all scriptural references were not available to common people back during this time. They were held by the priest, the Catholic priest, to which they were under his control, known as the Dark Ages. No one at this time had the supposed truth the priest had. So after James wrote that book, stop sharing that. So after James wrote that, he wrote the Bible. So I know the Bible and Christianity was attack. Well, the demonic book that he wrote was attack on witchcraft, okay? And then when he wrote the Bible, that was going to be an attack on the matriarchy, because all non-white cultures had different gods and goddesses that they paid homage to. They have a different spirituality. We had on the continent of Africa, the various countries within it had different spiritual views. The Africans were very connected to spirit. You know, they could see the spirit. They were in harmony with spirit. They were very peaceful, loving people. And they had gods like what you know as Osiris and Osiris, that they changed the names of their gods, the well-known gods. Osiris, originally the name was Asar, ASR. We don't know the original terminology because they didn't use vowels. And then, you know, Isis, but that's not the original name. It's AST, Aset, we say today. And so they changed the name. They forbid our language. And the language under the king's language keeps you under control, under a spell. And that's why they call it spelling. For instance, if you say, and I'm gonna say cancel, good morning, I don't use that term. What's good about morning? You say that every day, all day, and until afternoon. You have to watch your words. The king's language is full of spells that keep you under the status quo. In other languages, for instance, the mother tongue of African languages, they have a totally different way of speaking, and it doesn't keep you entrapped. You know, they say your thoughts are important because they create your reality. So does the things you speak. So many of the matriarchal cultures, Africans, natives, China, people, you know, they don't know their original language because they were forced to speak English. And that's part of the conditioning to bring about the one united kingdom that James foresaw that he needed to make. And think about it, they changed the timeline. Only Africa has the original time zone. Nobody else does. They changed the calendar. We don't really know what season it is. And then on the maps, the way Africa is, the continent of Africa is upside down. It should be turned the opposite way. And it should be the biggest continent on the map. And when you turn it the other way around, you can see how it connected to the other continents. But at some point in time, and I don't know when, I read it, but I don't know the exact date or the time period, the tectonic plates shifted and made a pathway. And that allowed people who were traveling in the ocean to go through Africa. That is how people, non-white people, were able to get into Africa because of that break. And so that's important to note. So I believe the Bible and Christianity was attack on the matriarchy and any spirituality or view outside of what the Bible has in it. So the first book King James wrote, Demonology, was to address the spread of witches and witchcraft in the country because they used to have so few of them, but then there became this big, a lot of people were practicing. So he wanted to cut that down. He felt a threat to his kingdom because of it. And so he started the Crusades. And he also went to war with the Catholic Church because he was trying to build a kingdom and the Catholic Church had all the power, right? And so that's why he started the Inquisitions. It was social control. They had a world government to build, and they could not have people of the same sex. And this is my point. They could not have people of the same sex. So they attacked those unions. They needed to build a kingdom. And it was also an attack on the matriarchy because women held power in the matriarchy and were revered and had power, and the goddesses were revered. So the cultures who practice spirituality in its truest form were attacked. Shamanism, medicine men and women, voodoo, and voodoo is not the way they practice it here in the West. It was different. And I've done some research on voodoo, and there's some changes that need to be made, but basically it's still not like it is here in the West. So it was an attack on the matriarchal people all over the world, and that's all non-white people. They torture people to accept the belief and acculturate them for future generations. The same from the Inquisitions to the start of colonization and enslavement. Just like they tortured the witches, they tortured enslaved people to accept and believe in the Bible. They tortured them mercilessly. And I've read a lot of stuff on that. Only on large plantations where there were so many slaves did they have freedom to practice their African spirituality in the church. So they could practice African spirituality. You'll see it in the Black church today. The speaking in tongues, all of that was African spirituality. Yet no Christian in the Black church today will accept that as part of their cultural roots. In fact, enslaved people did not start believing in the Bible until after the original captives had died off. It was like 2 to 3 generations after they passed, and all the ones born into enslavement, they started believing it. But it wasn't something that was originally accepted and believed. So we know it's social control. And so we talked about the early captives. So Sundays was a way for them to practice their African spiritual practices. So even the witches and warlocks, they feigned Christianity too. And to this day, they are still practicing, but claim to be Christians. Only the Black descendants of enslaved people are still believing in the Bible and adhering to it so strong that they will kick their young children out. 15, 16, however, whatever goes against the Bible, they will kick it out, kick somebody to the curb. So there are passages also in the Bible that's been plagiarized from ancient Egypt, or it was renamed Egypt. That's not the original name. Kemet. It's KMT. So we don't know the exact pronunciation, but we're pretty close. Kemet. So Christ is actually Heru with the Passover and also with Christmas. Who, I'm just not going to get into that yet. Well, that's a whole nother video. But I'm just simply a messenger of truth. I've been that, I'm born like that. I highlight the truth. I have a nature of not believing everything I see, hear, or read. I was like that as a child. I did not accept everything my mother or the adults around me said. I looked it up to make sure that it was true. I sense deception internally. I know when somebody's saying something that's not right. So I know most people can't handle this truth. And I do, and this is a pretty blatant message, but it's the truth. I'm revealing it today, and I know there's going to be some cognitive dissonance. I know people are going to be offended, but you need to hear this message and you need to really investigate and research for yourself. I left the church in 2003. I completely divested myself from all religion as I felt it was too oppressive. And I needed to raise my children in a manner that they could break family patterns and they can be in a positive environment, free of dysfunction, and have a sense of pride within themselves, their power, and their abilities. Now, the Bible and Christianity are tools King James used to control the masses and to keep them in mental enslavement and to prevent any other forms of spiritism. And that causes division among cultural groups. Because those who don't embrace the Bible or Christianity will separate from their family and children, etc. And this is the primary reason why parents are kicking their children and teens out of their homes onto the street all over the nation. I'm highlighting this because this Bible is a major factor in our separation as people, and it keeps us from our true powers. And it keeps us from being loving and supporting to our children or anyone else in our family who may be transgender, gay, or whatever. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. When I chose to leave the church in 2003, it was the best thing I could have done. I started receiving gifts that were dormant because of the church. The church's views and their methods suppresses your gifts. So I started seeing auras. It was gradual. I started seeing auras. I started hearing spirit. And whether you know it, a lot of places you live in, they have discarnate spirits in them, which is why you need to cleanse them. And I also heard my guides and angels, but yeah, and my hands activated, and I didn't even go to school for, at that time, for Reiki healing. They just activated, and I used my hands used to heat up, and I used to use it to heal my children. My grandmother had that gift. She did it in the church. She used her healing hands in the church. I wasn't associated with the church. Also, let me see. It's important to note that King James VI was also waging war on the Catholic Church because they held all the powers over the masses. They did not allow Bibles to the common people because they said it was sacred knowledge, belonged only to them, and they were the mediators of God. And King James needed to break that power so he can build his nation. So I've learned a lot of different modalities in healing. I mentioned biofeedback, but I also still have the capability to use healing with my hands, but I don't use it as a profession, so they don't heat up. I can still hear spirits. I see visions. I do things like that. I see auras on everything, the trees, the animals, on you. So my whole point in highlighting all of that stuff is simply to say, just because it's in the Bible doesn't make it true. And that we should live our lives the way the Bible, because it's King James. It's his philosophy on how people should be living their life. And if you kick out your child because they're gay or want to be transgender, if they say they hate their bodies and they're not who they say they are, they feel like they're the other gender, you should be trying to get them support so that they do not commit suicide. And so that's pretty much all I have to say on that. This is another segment on transgender support. You may not agree with it, but at least if I've opened anyone's eyes at all, research it. Because you can get that demonic Bible online for free. You can view it. And it was written way before he wrote the Bible. So he had an aim to write the demonic Bible for the Crusades and to root out witchcraft and other spirituality, because there were threats to his kingdom that he was building worldwide. And then he had to attack the matriarchy and bring in colonization and slavery with the Bible. And so there you have it. And I hope, thank you so much for listening to me today. Bye.